I'm Mark Canuel. I'm director of the Institute for the Humanities. Our next faculty fellow lecture is on February 17th at 4 p.m. With the location still to be announced. Professor Rachel Weber at that lecture will be presenting from her work on the urban oracular, prediction and speculation in real estate. On February 18th, Martín, a Bridge to Faculty Scholar in the Philosophy Department, will be hosting a workshop on social ontologies of oppression, solidarity, and care, featuring early career scholars in philosophy exploring intersectional accounts of oppression. That's going to be very exciting, and if you're interested, you can visit our website and register for it. There is some reading material in advance. I also want to alert you to our visiting fellow events. Gerald Horn will be visiting us in the spring. We're still figuring out whether we can do this in person or whether it will be virtual. On April 26th and April 27th, you'll be hearing much more about those events, but just put it on your calendar now. Gerald Horn is one of the most important scholars of early American Black history and is author most recently of The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. I just love that title of the Long 16th Century. We have many, many other events coming up, so do get our mailing list if you're not already on it by emailing us at hummins@uic.edu in the chat. Also in the chat is our website, which you can visit, which has a complete calendar. It's my great, great pleasure today to introduce Esther Díaz Martín, our first faculty fellow lecturer of the semester, our second of the year. Professor Martín received her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin and joined us on the faculty at UIC in 2019. Her areas of inquiry are in Chicana and Latinx studies, Chicana feminisms, Latinx literature and popular culture, sound studies, US Spanish language radio, and Latinx podcasting and digital cultures. Her research is situated at the intersections of gender studies, feminism, and Latinx studies as she explores the contemporary mediations of Latina and Chicana feminisms. This affords a view of women's voices as embodied, but also mediated, with an attention to the interrelations of the content of feminist thought and the actual material voice in which the thought is communicated. She's published work on this and related topics in a range of venues, including the Spanish and Portuguese Review and Chicana Latina Studies. And I would also highly recommend an autobiographical piece with Jose Garcia on being a first-generation academic couple. After reading this, I felt like it should be required reading for everyone in our school, in all schools. She has very ambitiously elevated attention to Latinx sound studies by organizing an undergraduate conference here in 2019. And she has spoken widely on gender, sound studies, Latinx literature, anti-colonialist theoretical approaches, and so on in her conference presentations and invited lectures. Her work has been supported by numerous awards and other recognitions from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies, and the Mellon Foundation. It's been a joy to have Professor Martín here with us for this year at the Institute, and I warmly invite you to join me in welcoming her to discuss her work on feminist politics in Chicana Latina podcasting. Let's give it up for Esther Díaz Martín.
Thank you everyone. So greetings, good afternoon, good evening-ish. Thank you for taking time to join me. And I'd like to give a special thank you to the Institute for the Humanities. Mark, thank you for the lovely introduction. Yeah, we can talk about that piece that I wrote with my partner, but that was a very strong one. But that documents my process of getting here to UIC, actually. I'd like to extend a thank you to the Institute for the Humanities at UIC and the faculty fellowship this year for supporting my research. So today I'm presenting one chapter from the book manuscript that I've been working on the topic. Let me start my slides here. On the book is about Latinas in contemporary radio. So again, listening for gender politics and Latina feminisms in contemporary radio in the last 30 years. And centered specifically in the Los Angeles area, because that's sort of a center for the production of radio and podcasting. And the piece that I'm presenting to you today is the chapter on podcasting. And so along the way, you'll also hear some clips as well, and I hope to make it worth your time. So the idea for the book stems from my experience listening to radio, really, my personal experience in the early 1990s when my family migrated from rural Mexico to rural Central California. Radio was a constant presence in our household. So my mom would listen all morning to Radio Hablada, which is Spanish language talk radio. And that's sort of where I was introduced to one of the feminism, really, through one of the locutoras, one of the radio hosts that I'll talk about in a minute. And then at one point, it was 5 kids and 2 parents. It was 7 of us in this trailer home in a dairy. And so at one point, there were 3 teenagers in the home that were all sort of searching for their identities through the available radio stations. Interesting. And it was a sort of media was always on, either the TV or radios. And it was like an all night phenomenon, because my dad would get up at 3:00 in the morning for, to go to attend to the cows. And at that time he would turn on AM radio. And if you know anything about AM radio is particularly really like crisp and bright at night. It comes through, it like cuts through mountains and everything. And so at 3:00 in the morning, when my dad would turn on the radio to like listen to rancheras and other sort of very interesting programs at that time, it would wake me up. And when it stopped waking me up, it was still there as a sort of a constant presence. So later, as I joined the workforce in my 20s and 30s, between school and work, I listened pretty regularly through my commute, just going to school and work. And so in the mornings, it was regional Mexican music, because it's like banda and it's really loud and it kind of shakes you awake and really upbeat. But there's also a fair share of misogyny in regional Mexican music, and it was sort of to like rile myself up, right? Rile my feminist rage early in the morning, and then in the afternoon, typically NPR. And when I lived in Austin, Texas, I would listen to Radio Mujer Austin, which is a type of women's magazine. So out of these experiences in being introduced to sound studies and radio studies at UT, I wanted to do this research on Latinas in radio. But taking a step back, another influential work indeed is Dolores Inez Huerta, and she argues, something that resonates with my experience. So in her book, Sounds of Belonging, she argues that for immigrant and brown collar U.S. Latino communities, radio listening provides a sense of political belonging within a country that regards them as second-class citizens. So moreover, since radio's beginning in 1940s, for Latinos community, Spanish language radio served to maintain a sense of identity, and at times it was a very effective tool for political organizing. So as I began to research the work specifically of Latina women in radio, I was really surprised by the lack of scholarship on the subject. And most of the, it's growing a little with some recent publications, but most of the limited scholarship on U.S. Latino radio has focused on really just tracking how much it's grown, so its growth. And in some cases, they do discuss the work of influential male radio hosts. But this is slowly changing, and this is something that I hope to contribute to. But the lack of scholarship is partly explained by the fact that radio broadcasts are an ephemeral product. So until more recently, broadcasts were just one-off, right? They were seldom recorded or archived. Also, as a thing of popular culture, it doesn't receive the same attention as like literature or visual arts. But yeah, there's a problem of like the lack of actual material to listen to, right? But also I found out through my research, women radio hosts or locutoras who rise in popularity and demand better working conditions, better opportunities, promotions, or just fair pay, they they get pushed out in many ways by this male-dominated industry. And this is something that I heard again and again with the radio hosts that I interviewed. So my book sets out to contribute to the developed history of Latinas in U.S. radio by documenting the work of locutoras at the turn into the digital age. So roughly the last 30 years or so, and like I said, it's centered around Los Angeles. But the last 30 years are important for media culture in general because of the rapid evolution and spread of digital media and the advent of the so-called sharing economy. So things like open source collaborations, blogs, social media, and how it's changed the culture into a culture of like sharing our private lives. So that's why I wanted to focus on this particular moment. So in my research, this is not moving forward. So my research is guided by two main questions. One, what does feminism sound like in Latinx radio? And so with this question, let me just put everything up so I don't have to struggle. So with this question, the first question, I seek to describe the performance of gendered sound and voice as an instrument of feminist praxis. And the second question, which kind of has two parts, is how is the work of Latina radio feminism achieved? So the first part of this question really seeks to document the stories of women who managed to succeed in hostile male-dominated industry and how they went about doing so, how they navigated the off-the-air gender politics. But then the second part of this question is where I think about the non-visible yet physical trabajo, and I describe it as both a labor, a work, and a product, or what I call a trabajo que no se ve. So I theorize this idea that trabajo que no se ve is achieved through the oral and oral experience. So in other words, how do feminist politics become an action through radiophonic listening experience, which includes its production, its voicing, and then the listening experience as well. Okay, so for this, I developed this methodology, which let me put this up. Let me go back one. So as far as the methodology, I designed an approach to listening as a decolonizing research method that draws from Chicana feminist scholarship and also sound studies. So I call it a nepantlera critical listening, which takes into account the inherent subjectivity of listening and my positionality as both an insider participant in this culture, right? But also as an outsider academic moving across in multiple modes of listening. So at times, not yet. So at times I become a co-locutora with my research participants. And for instance, if the picture in the flyer for this lecture, I'm actually right there in the corner. I can go back. You can see it. I'm actually there, right? So what happened was that I approached Chicana Motherwork podcast, and they said, okay, great. Yeah, you can interview us and let's make it into a podcast, right? So I'm actually in the podcast doing my research and interviewing them. So I kind of become, this is just one example in which I'm participating and becoming a co-locutora. So in doing so, I center locutoras' insight into how they make meaning of their own sound, identities, and politics. So I'm there, but I also want to decenter my interpretations as like the expert, right? I want to see, well, what do they think about their sound? How do they make meaning of their identity and politics? And as I found out, some of them didn't identify as Latina. So those are all things that I explore in the book. Finally, my methodology also considers the performance of voice as both a semantic political medium and a physical and embodied experience through which gender politics are voiced and contested. So in other words, I'm paying attention to both the content of the speech, right, and the performance of sound and voice that frames discourse, and how these two elements combine to articulate different versions of feminism that are specific to different cultural contexts. And so you'll see some of that definitely in the chapter. But very quickly, as quickly as I am able, okay, so there's that. So as quickly as I'm able, I'll summarize the first two chapters. So in the first chapter, I write about Alicia Larcon, who is the one that I was listening to when I was early teen, that my mom would listen to. She is a journalist and a writer and an AM talk show host that's been active between 1991 and 2015. And she is a Mexican transfronteriza who came of age in the 1980s. And her critique focuses on anti-Latino racism and political corruption and aims to politicize its listeners. Her performance includes dichos or idioms, right, regaños or reprimands, and a satire that's flavored with performances of like feminine moral outrage. And then next, I write about Marlene Quinto, who is an early millennial. She grew up poor and undocumented in a Los Angeles barrio. And Marlene begins as an unpaid intern and eventually becomes a nationally syndicated morning show co-host. She performs a loud chola, bicultural, and confident woman who calls out machismo and gender double standards and also promotes a body positive gordi buena politic. And there's a lot more to it, but Marlene also pioneered the use of social media to promote herself on the radio. And so she's sort of like a transitional character where she's done radio and also digital radio and podcasting and then back to radio. So at one point, she was being replaced by a younger, like more conventional feminine co-host. And but she actually was able to use her social media following, which she'd been cultivating, as a way to kind of keep her career, to fight for her career, and so she's still on the radio. And so the chapter I'm presenting on today continues on this theme of the merging of radio and social media through podcasting. So podcasting has been around since the mid 2000s, but Latinx podcasting really began to take off from 2015 forward. So in comparison to AM/FM radio, the costs are much, much lower. And as such, historically marginalized voices now have a powerful medium to find their audiences and be heard. Podcasting repackages live radio as an asynchronous product that is no longer live in the sense that we can just, turn on a button and we hear the live co-host, the live, radio host or DJs. But it does continue to provide the feelings of liveliness, co-presence, and intimacy that characterize radio. Thus, I argue it is a type of radiophonic media or radio-like. However, I reframe these concepts of liveliness, co-presence, and intimacy through a Latina framework as spaces of convivencia. And I will talk more about spaces of convivencia in a minute in my analysis. So I will be speaking about the sounded feminist politics of three podcasts, Super Mamás, established in 2015. And that's one of she's like, they're the OGs. They're considered the OGs, but that's the longest established. And then Chicana Mother Work and Locatora Radio that started in 2016. And all of these are still active. So the Super Mama podcast is one of the longest running, like I said. As of today, it's nearing 300 episodes. And Super Mamás is spelled in Spanish and it's pronounced in Spanish like Super Mamás. That's how they say it. But the podcast is almost completely in English with some code switching to Spanish, which is not always translated. It is produced and hosted by sisters Paulina and Bricia Lopez. They are business entrepreneurs and co-owners of a Oaxaca-themed restaurant called La Guelaguetza near downtown LA. They are first-generation immigrants, but they don't refer to their experience or to their an immigrant identity. Rather, they like to say that they moved from Oaxaca to California. And so they come from a family of entrepreneurs that were importing Oaxacan products to Oaxacan communities in California. And they also speak a lot about how their parents instilled with them a very strong work ethic and this spirit of entrepreneurship. They also speak a lot about how their parents would make like a lot of sacrifices and movidas to make sure that they had access to the best educational opportunities in the US. The idea for the podcast was prompted from their experiences as new mothers, attending mommy and me meetings, and also listening to what they call mommy podcast. But in those experiences, they were not hearing their concerns as Latino moms in these spaces. And so they saw the podcast as an opportunity to share their unique perspective and talk about issues that were not being talked about, such as raising bicultural and bicultural and bilingual children, and also other traditional birthing and child rearing practices that they learn from their culture and from their mom. But the other thing is that they also saw the podcast as an opportunity to escape the boredom and isolation of early motherhood. I don't know how many mothers that we have in the room that can relate to this experience, but when I started listening to them for research, I was also a new mom, not a young mom, but a new mom with a 1-year-old at home, and I was a full-time PhD, ABD candidate. So I was isolated, like doubly isolated. As a new mom, the world kind of forgets about you and moves on. But then also as an ABD candidate, and I was on campus at the time, I was also, isolated and away from everyone. So I definitely relate to that experience, and was listening right from that moment in my life. So the podcast covers a number of topics, including early motherhood and parenting, but also topics related to health, lifestyle, relationships, and themes related to work and career aspirations. As an underlying theme, which is implied in the title of the podcast, is the idea of celebrating women's ability to balance all of the simultaneous demands while keeping a positive outlook. So now we can go ahead and listen to the first clip. And so what you're gonna hear is just the opening of the podcast. And what I would like you to pay attention to as you listen is the musical choices and whatever you can pick up as the sort of mood that they're establishing through their voices and dialogues. And so what I would actually like you to do is go to the chat box and we're going to post a link. Linda has posted a link. So if you just go ahead and click on the link and listen on your own, it's about 1 minute, and then I'll resume. I always really enjoy watching people's reactions when they listen to the clips I choose. Say they sound fun. Yeah, it's definitely fun. So throughout the book, okay, let me see if I can get myself back here. Okay. So throughout the book, I argue that locutoras create a sounded space of convivencia. And these are spaces where families and communities come together with cariño or loving care to share and produce and reproduce knowledge, and where the next generation is invited into the community. So in the opening, you heard a playful cumbia sonidera that rips off of the theme of the 1980s cartoon Inspector Gadget. And I don't know if anyone picked up on that, but if you think of the Inspector Gadget theme, it was kind of playing around with it. But even before the music comes in, the first sound that you hear is actually Paulina's laughter. So laughter, giggles, lighthearted jokes, and silliness are sprinkled throughout the podcast. So even in the episodes that really difficult subjects such as miscarriage or losing a child, there's always some laughter that's framing the podcast at the beginning or at the end. And there's one that's very interesting that you all might want to listen to from December of 2020, when one of the families, they all had COVID, like before the vaccines, and even the grandparents that were visiting from Mexico. And so as they were retelling the story, right, there was a lot of like the type of jokes that only like your sisters would make, right, to kind of make light of the situation. So Through the sound of laughter, the Lopez sisters perform happiness and model maintaining a positive outlook to life's challenges that are particular, that especially those that are particular to mothers. The sound of laughter also promotes feelings of intimacy. So laughing is a type of intimate resonance and co-feeling. This is prompted in the podcast when they share inside jokes or family anecdotes that then they go on to explain and retell for the benefit of the audience and really to invite us into their space of convivencia. And this idea of listening as intimacy, right, comes from sound studies and this idea that when you hear something or when sound reaches you, it actually touches you because it actually goes into your ear and vibrates your inner ear, which is a bone, right? So in this way, there's a physical resonance, a physical touching that happens that is different than the visual experience, for example, where, things don't come and touch your eye or they don't vibrate in your eye, but with sound, it does vibrate. So in this vibration, it's a co-feeling, right? And especially when it's someone else's voice, you're feeling, and this co-feeling creates compassion, and this type of compassion is a type of intimacy as well. So throughout the podcast, we also hear other sounds that contextualize how the podcast is produced. And the recording studio where they started recording and where I interviewed them was actually just a corner in like you enter the lobby of the restaurant and then there's like the little side office. And this is like no bigger than a closet, right? And they have like a copy machine and everything else. So at times you hear in the podcast, like there's someone like an employee in the background, like shuffling papers or making copies. Or sometimes when there's music in the restaurant, you kind of hear it, the vibration on the wall. Sometimes there might be a child in the room, but that wasn't really the case until after COVID when they needed to start doing the podcast remotely, in which case sometimes the children do kind of interrupt in, but they're not really invited or featured as one of the sounds of the podcast. So like the word super in Super Mamás, the recording space represents this multitasking entity that takes in, negotiates, and accommodates. And as a metaphor of motherhood, being super echoes the notion that mothers are multitaskers by nature and necessity. A mama's reproductive, intellectual, and emotional energy is constantly negotiated between caring for her children, herself, and pursuing her professional aspirations. And attempting to thrive across all of these roles is presented not only as the journey of motherhood, but a journey that is to be enjoyed. The mood established in their sound is consistent with this mission statement: we are gathered to enjoy the extraordinary journey that is womanhood. So here, womanhood is defined through cisgender and heteronormative binary. The idea of being super extraordinary echoes this sort of having it all narrative that was popular in the early 1980s, But in the podcast, there is some recognition to cultural-specific gender experiences. Their objective, however, is not to be critical of what makes mothers have to put on this superhero persona, but to champion and co-champion and celebrate mothers for all that we do. So certain phrases that you also hear in the podcast, such as becoming a better version of ourselves every day and finding our purpose, are drawn from the positive psychology movement, and which promotes optimism as a foundation for health, creativity, and productivity for individuals and society, but lacks critical analysis. So I wanted to say something about this positive psychology, that one of its spokespersons is Oprah Winfrey, and that's someone that they reference in the podcast. So positivity is a central part of the Super Mama brand, and also reflected in their musical choices. As Paulina explains regarding the music that they chose for the podcast, it represents us and is who we are. You can't listen to music and not be moving. It's about getting together to chill, have fun, dance, drink micheladas, and be happy. So the reference here to identity is referring to their familia convivencia, right? To chill implies being in good company where one feels accepted and uninhibited, which is not specifically to any type of, which is not specific to a particular ethnic identity. The micheladas reference here is actually referencing a beer cocktail mix that they sell through their company, and you can check them out from at ilovemole.com. And in this way, their identity is interwoven with their brand and their marketing strategy as well. So in marketing, a brand is purposely vague and seeks to just simply create a positive feeling about a product. So Paulina explains the brand as a personal embodiment. She shared, we realize that we are our products. We are a walking reflection of all our products, the michelada and so forth. We have to embody all the brands all of the time. We don't need to have a commercial spot for any other products because we are the talking brand. So through the sharing economy, what they define as a super mama sisterhood is a cisgender, woman positive, Oaxaca, California brand. It builds community empowerment by supporting mothers with information and resources, and is less concerned with a critique of power. So moving to the second podcast, Chicana Motherwork podcast is produced by 4 women in the early stages of their postdoctorate careers and one recently tenured professor. And their names are right there on the slide. I'm not going to read them all, but there they are. They share a similar upbringing as second-generation Mexican Americans who grew up on the West Coast. 2 were raised in Los Angeles, 1 in San Francisco Bay Area, and 1 is a San Diego, Tijuana transfronteriza. They list their identities as Mexicana Indígena, Chicana, Chicana, Latina, and Afro-Chicana. These hybrid identities reflect a central discourse of Chicana politics, which recognizes Mexican indigenous and African heritage as part of a Chicanismo identity, which also implies the political ideology that is critical of patriarchy, white supremacy, internal colonization, and capitalist imperialism, which is a critique rooted in the Chicano movement. The idea of the podcast originated at a Malx academic conference in 2015. And like the Lopez sisters of Supermamás, these Latina scholars noticed a lack of representation of their experience as mothers of color in the specific profession of academia. So they were also familiar with Supermamás and felt that they needed to, they shared that they wanted to also present a more critical perspective than what Supermamás was doing. The podcast stated objective to, quote, amplify the lived experience of mothers of color within and outside academia, represents a social justice discourse of political solidarity with other marginalized women across racial and economic class. To date, they have 32 episodes, which is, shy of the 300 that Supermamás have, but still it's very impressive considering that we're dealing with the schedules of 5 academic mothers and then the guests that they invite on the show. The concept of mother work was first theorized by Black feminist scholar Patricia Phil Collins. Chicana mother work, but with parentheses around the word other, centers on Chicana experiences and emphasizes the othering that mothers in academic spaces. It underscores the marginal positionality of Latina academics who make up only 4% of tenure and tenure-track faculty. This underrepresentation is attributed to the cultural biases that disadvantage Latinas, institutional barriers, and the added weight of obligations to one's family, community, and mentoring work that is often undervalued within the profession. In their co-authored anthology, Chicana Motherwork, the anthology, they forward 6 core ideas. So the podcast recognizes intergenerational mother work through dedication segment, where they dedicate or they speak about recently deceased mothers of colors and people in the social justice movement, and they're remembered through these dedications. But there's also references to ancestral knowledge. The phrase Chicana mother work means carving space. This idea of carving space is a reference to Gloria Saldúa, who argued that Chicana bodies are transgressive in academia because they exist in a space that was not created for them. And for instance, in one episode, they critique the lack of childcare in academic conference that are also typically held in locations that are not family friendly. So academic mothers of color, and especially those on the job market, are forced to conceal their maternity. This in turn sustains, or their motherhood, I guess. This in turn sustains the quote racialized discourses that render Latinx bodies and sexualities as dirty, deviant, and diseased, end quote. Such that the uncontrolled sexuality is both aberrant and manipulative, intent of producing so-called anchor babies that degrade the racial makeup of the U.S. Can't see my thing. Chicana mother work means healing ourselves. So this idea of healing ourselves is defined as a process of confronting our pain to find joy. The pain and injury from which one heals is a critique of the violent legacy of patriarchy and colonization that manifests itself as intergenerational trauma. So healing is both an individual and a communal practice that is holistic. And this, I argue, is sounded through, you'll hear their sound in a minute, but through their like low volume, slow rate of speech, and which induces a more meditative form of listening. An example of communal healing was a whole episode that they dedicated following the November 2016 presidential election, which was traumatic, especially and painful, right? Especially for women, immigrants, and minorities who have been target of the vile political rhetoric. So they spend the whole episode just healing from that. Evoking the idea of an imaginary. I'm just gonna put all of them up. So evoking the idea of an imaginary signals a utopian agenda that is fluid and seeks to connect to ancestral knowledge. So that was the fourth one. And then the next one, Chicana mother work makes our labor visible. Again, the labor that is to be made visible is that which in the eyes of the academia is considered a distraction, including the invisible labor of mothers who must, quote, teach our children to love their brown skin. Okay, so let's go ahead and listen to their opening, and then I'll continue with my analysis. So again, if you would locate the link in the chat box and listen specifically, again, for the music, but also for the volume and the pacing of their voices, and anything that to you signals like a Chicana sound. Okay. So sounding mother work begins with a mid-tempo beat that is reminiscent of 1970s Chicano rock. If any of you listen to Los Lobos, and that cowbell kind of gives it away. This homemade recording plays tribute to that rascuache aesthetic form based on DIY ingenuity and resiliency. And in fact, it was one of their partners who put together this clip in their home studio. And we also hear the voice of a child that is the one to greet us. So this is manifesting a different type of familial space of convivencia. This one where future generation of Chicanas and Chicanos are invited to contribute in their parents' intellectual, political, and artistic projects. Locutora voices are low in both volume and pitch, requiring active listening in order to kind of keep up with the cognitive heavy vocabulary that they throw your way. Um, in the opening, you hear a lot of specialized phrases and things that are very familiar to us or as academics, right? But even my first time listening, I had to listen to it several times and see it written down to really understand everything that they were saying in this really loaded mission statement. So you do have to pay attention. And then there's a switch to Spanish as well. So I argue that this discourse reflects the host political ideology, but also the imagination of an intended listener, right? The intended listener is other Chicana Latina mother scholars and perhaps colleagues and perhaps potential employers and maybe their undergrad students. So given this target audience and the stakes involved for scholars on the job market, some passages you can tell that they're being read from carefully pre-written text. This aspect of their positionality or their sitio lengua is also reflected in numerous pauses, suggesting, and you don't hear that in the opening, but in the podcast, they speak and they pause quite a bit. And so this is suggesting that the speaker is carefully choosing her words to best reflect her understanding of complex ideas in an unrehearsed manner, right? So this is also a reference to the academic modes of thinking and writing and teaching where precision and clarity of ideas are important. This slide that I'm going to share with you is representative of the pauses that I was just mentioning. So this is they invited Chicana writer Ana Castillo, who's a pretty big deal, and it's definitely a high stress situation to have her on your podcast. And after she finished this really lengthy monologue, one of the locutoras had to respond, right? And so you can tell that from what I'm talking about, just as a visual, everywhere that I put a parenthesis, it was like a pause. Other patterns of speech that I notice in the sound reference indigenous epistemology and practice. So when they're taking turns, this follows a circular pattern, which recalls the indigenous healing ritual of a temescal or not yet. Yeah, temescal or a sweat lodge. I don't know if you all been to one, but you go around in a circle and it's also a healing ritual. They in their anthology they write about the collective knowledge making through the rebozo metaphor for gendered ways of knowing. So a rebozo is a traditional weave cloth used by Mesoamerican women to protect herself and her children, and also used in childbirth. So like a rebozo, the Chicana motherword collective testimonio is weaved together from multiple voices or threads to become this collective voice. This voice is a source of strength and protection and gives birth to Chicana ways of knowing. Chicana motherword solicits a meditative mode of listening, as I was saying, which only pairs well to other types of quiet meditative practices like art making, and not really possible when you're driving or trying to clean or anything like that. I tried, and you can, like with Super Mamás, you can listen to them when you're cleaning, but not with Chicana motherword. You really have to be paying attention. But I was able to do other things that were more like drawing or things like that. So I think this reflects the intention of the podcast as a healing practice where wounds are gently and judiciously re-examined in order to progress healing, and it echoes the practice of Chicana feminist writing. Okay, so let's see. Hang in there. This is the final one. So finally, Locatora Radio is hosted by Zoe Muñoz and Ariana Rodriguez Sertruche, who go by the aliases Mala Muñoz and Diosa Fem. As of today, the podcast has published nearly 300 bi-monthly episodes, which they call capítulos of they call it the radiophonic novela. So this podcast seeks to explore, quote, layers and levels of feminism and race, mental health, trauma, gender experience, sexuality, and oppression. And Mala Muñoz, who you see on the left, works at as a crisis counselor at a rape and domestic violence agency. and has contributed to online publications, including Vice and the HuffPost. And Diosa Fem manages services for individuals with developmental disabilities and also writes for online publications, including Remezcla. Mala is a third generation Chicana with Mexican and Puerto Rican heritage, and Diosa is a second generation Mexican and Peruvian. In 2016, when they were recent college graduates, when they started the podcast in their mid 20s, they lived at home with their extended families in Los Angeles. They met through social media through a collective of Latina artists and activists called the Mami Collective. And out of these exchanges, they decided to start a podcast where they could continue the type of conversations that they had enjoyed and were having recently in their gender studies classes and in activist spaces in college. I believe Diosa was at UC Santa Barbara and Mala was at Tufts College. So here, the term mami in the Mami Collective does not reference motherhood at all. They're not mothers, but a reimagination of the Latina video vixen stereotype of the 1990s hip hop culture. So in that culture, the mami in that context is this hypersexualized lower class woman of Puerto Rican or Dominican descent with European features. However, when evoked by Locatora Radio, the mami is reinterpreted as an empowered woman who is unapologetic and comfortable in her body. She speaks freely and enjoys the unconditional love of her friends and dresses sexy for her own benefit, her self-gaze, and the gaze of the collective as a means, as a means for personal and community empowerment. The term mami is also evoked in their tagline, Mamis of Myth and Bullshit, which is a line from a poem by Mexican-American author Sandra Cisneros. And they consider her a patron saint of the podcast and a role model for transgressive femininity. A central theme of Locatora Radio is a queer, femme-centered gender and sexual politics. Mala is cisgender and describes herself as a loca, bruja, and hoe, and other reclaimed labels of female transgression. Diosa identifies as queer high femme and dates both cisgender men and queer women. The term high femme refers to a preference for an exaggerated gender performance of femininity, which is also you're gonna maybe you hear it. I guess maybe you could hear it in their vocal performance. Maybe you won't hear it in the clip. Maybe you will. I don't know. But definitely in the podcast, there's this performance of exaggerated femininity. The terms femmes and women of color, spelled with an X, reflect an understanding of gender as socially constructed and fluid. Femmes is inclusive of trans women and gender fluid and non-binary individuals as well. The word locatora, and I don't know if you picked up on that, but instead of locutora, which would be radio host, it's locatora with a prefix loca, which means crazy woman in Spanish. And it's a slur directed at women, especially those who rebel against gender cultural norms. Mala and Diosa argue that women are not in fact crazy, but that the world is a violent, crazy-making place for women and femmes who are often blamed for the violence that is enacted upon them. Okay, so now we can hear the final clip, and again, it's the first minute of their opening. And so again, listen for the music that they use and the performance of their voice. So we'll post the link in the chat. There it is. In Boyle Heights, yeah. Okay. So, regarding their sound, so the quality of the sound, especially in their first year, I think I'm on. Am I on? Yeah. Y'all can hear me, right? Um, so it's especially in the first year when they begin to teach themselves how to sound edit, so they do everything themselves, was inconsistent, and it's part of a DIY, low budget, sort of self-taught sound. The podcast is recorded, she said Radio Espacio, but it's actually Radio Sombra at a community radio station in Mariachi Plaza in Boyle Heights. And then the shop is called Espacio 1839. And so you walk in and there's this little hallway, and then you have the radio station sort of facing Mariachi Plaza. So when they're recording, they're actually looking out into Mariachi Plaza. And then around the studio, which is encased in glass, it's this like gift shop where they have like Chicana art. And so because of that space, you actually hear a lot of background sounds such as street traffic, or if there's a mariachi music event happening, you actually hear it in the podcast. You hear some of that sound, and also people, dogs or like people coming in and out and into the gift shop. So it creates a sound frame that roots their voices within the soundscape of urban Mexican Los Angeles. So regarding the reggaeton beat, the music, right? The reggaeton beat reflects a millennial Latinx pop culture. So this style originated in Puerto Rico, but became mainstream across the Americas in the early 2000s, complementing hip hop culture with similar visual and lyrical themes that reflect the lives of the working poor class. So the music is worth noting in relation to sounding gender politics because it's described as, quote, hyper masculine to an extreme. The majority of it's male reggaeton performers convey women as characters for derision or conquest. In reggaeton, women's voices are also used as a sonic prop to respond to the expressions of male desire and dominance. Yet, Locatora Radio employs the sound of reggaeton to reinscribe a femme sex-positive narrative. Regarding the sound of high femme gender identity, in Mala's voice, high feminist is expressed like loudly, she's louder. The alias Mala means bad, and it's suggestive, like una mala, like a bad woman, and it's suggested in her vocal style. So a loud woman transgresses heteronormative conventions that equate like quiet voices and refinement, and loudness with like being loudly uncouth and civilized, right? Mala often erupts in laughter and raises her voice when she kind of goes into these rants where she's role playing scenarios in which she's talking back to misogynists that she encounters in her daily life, or she talks back to like patriarchy itself in this really like loud rants. And so the rants against misogynists are unscripted, but they sound really well rehearsed. And this is likely, due to her job as a women's advocate at a crisis center, and also she runs self-defense classes. So she's a self-defense instructor as well. In Diosa's voice, high femme is sounded as softness she has more of a low volume, like softer speech, more gentle, sometimes a little like breathy or kind of thin in her delivery. And of the two, Diosa, and she's the one on the right, is the one that's more likely to cadence statements by raising the pitch of her voice, which is suggestive of a question and is usually interpreted as a lack of confidence. But in their dialogue, when this happens, the high-pitched cadences signal a request for Mala to affirm Diosa or to continue her train of thought, especially when they're exhausted. She has exhausted from speaking about an emotionally charged topic. So in another part of their sounded feminism, which you don't hear in the opening, but it's in the podcast, is what I call sounds of affirmation. So during their dialogues, they interject with phrases and sounds that signal agreement, encouragement, or inspiration. And I have just this transcript that I'm not going to read, but just a sort of a visual representation of what these interjections are like. In one of their most popular capítulos on the topic of femtech, which is actually it's used it's used in by excuse me, it's used in university classrooms like this. This is a really good capítulo. The locutoras affirm each other's situated knowledge while theorizing the knowledge traditions of women of color and also feminist epistemology. So they in this whole capítulo they're theorizing concepts such as femtech, brujeria, abuelita tech, abuelita knowledge, fem defense, and loca epistemologies. So you kind of hear a lot of affirmation back and forth. Okay. So to conclude, podcasting allows for the construction of Latina spaces of convivencia, which are multi-generational generational spaces organized and maintained by women with cariño and reciprocity, where a new generation is recruited and communal knowledge is produced and reproduced. The sound marks of each podcast sound specific intersectional lived experiences and by extension, feminist praxis that construct distinct versions of community empowerment. Super Mamás sounds a translocal, bicultural Oaxaca, California identity. Their sound creates intimacy and connection through laughter and lighthearted convivencia between the siblings. They promote entrepreneurship and mother-centered solidarity using the language of positive psychology that, without critique, extends the expectations of individual achievement into all other areas of a mother's life. Chicana motherwork sounds a process of communal intergenerational in decolonizing healing through the low volume, pauses, and prepared monologues that reflect their literary traditions of Chicana theory, such as Testimonio en Rebozo, and also solicits a meditative mode of listening for healing. And Locatora Radio sounds their feminist praxis through the language of millennial hip-hop, sonic imaginaries, affirmations, and the voicing of high femme aesthetics that reclaims male-centric expressions of dominance and desire as an expression for women's empowerment, such as that of the mami and loca personas. These podcasts sound their specific sitio y lengua, which is a perspective and the cultural vocabulary that reflects a particular social and cultural space that they navigate to make their livelihood. So their sounded spaces of convivencia also reflect the listeners that they hope to connect with. Through podcasting, Latinas build their brands, professional profiles, and connect with potential collaborators. Moreover, podcasts represent a live autobiographical archive of Latina culture and gender politics, which was previously unheard. Okay, thank you. That's all I have. Hey.
Thank you so much, Esther. It was such a stimulating talk, and I'm so glad that you gave us the examples to accompany. I'm sure that we have some questions. So when you do have a question, you can raise your hand, use the cute little hand raise function on Zoom. You can also just, if you are on video, you can just raise your hand and I'll probably catch you, or in the chat, just tell us that you have a question and we'll get to you. I am just going to start things off, Esther. I've had the benefit and pleasure of listening, of hearing a couple of parts, hearing and reading a couple of parts of your project, and I've been struck by the distinctions in the types of sound and the types of ideologies that you're talking about. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this word that you use, the convivencia, and that, and maybe just explaining a little bit more about why you use that term, because it strikes me as certainly a way of talking about the way that you talk about the communication of happiness with supermamas, and happiness being something that is advertised and branded and shared and communal in that particular environment. But But when you talk about the Locatora Radio, that sounds really, just the terms that you use of the transgressive aspect of it and the ranting, that almost seemed to challenge the idea of a convivencia. And so I guess I'm wondering, how important are these real distinctions in the way that you think about a community are in your project? That, for one, there's a kind of communication of this ideology of happiness, but in the other, in the Locatora Radio, that doesn't quite sound like a sharing of ideology, but a much more contestatory, much more agonistic sharing, but nonetheless something that is about argument. And so how is that all part of one term, convivencia? Those two seem, to me, just in your beautiful explanation of it and even in the sound aspect, they seem really, really different.
Yeah, thank you for that question. In what I've written about convivencia, like happiness was never really, or joyfulness was never, or positive feelings even were never really like a central component of it. It's just not something that I thought about, but I'll give you some background as to where this idea comes from. So in a previous publication that I co-authored, it was a food-centered life histories of Mexican immigrant women in the in the U.S., which is a really fancy way of saying we interviewed our moms. So we interviewed our moms about their food practices, for them to tell us about what foods that they know how to prepare and what they mean to them. So in that research, we wrote about the centrality of maize, right, of corn, in Mexican families. And one of the idea of the convivencia, or the space of convivencia, actually comes from this interview where one of our participants described the molino. And the molino, type it out, molino, is a place that doesn't exist anymore. But with like neoliberal restructuring, the molino disappeared, and with like technological innovation, but also with migration. So the molino is this, ¿cómo se dice? A mill. So it's a place where women take our mothers used to take the nixtalamized corn in like buckets, and show up really early in the morning and wait in line for their nixtamal to be turned into masa harina, flour, right? Corn flour for tortillas and so forth. And so this molino was a space of convivencia because it was ran by women, right? So it was a gendered space, and it was producing a particular type of gender knowledge, gender epistemology, a way of knowing and knowledge that was specific to the women that participated in the space. But it was different because it was also a place of horizontal power relationships. And it was a place where, so there wasn't like a hierarchy. It was a place of reciprocity. It was a place where women come together to exchange the news, or exchange chismes, right? Exchange the news about what's going on in the rancho or in the town, right? And so the elements of the space of convivencia are the reciprocity that takes place, in which it's organized through the dynamic of reciprocity, which is a horizontal power relationships, and where knowledge is produced and reproduced, but also where the new generation of women are invited into this community and in this gendered way of knowing. So I took that idea from that publication, and I think the idea of cariño is something that has been worked by education scholars regarding like care in the home in the context of education scholarship. And so that's sort of where that idea comes from. And those are the elements that make up the convivencia. And I suppose, I don't know, so the idea of happiness, I suppose it is a positive space. But I did insist on not saying that it's a place of bonding or co-living, because like bonding doesn't really capture everything. And co-living doesn't really capture it either, because you're not living together, but it directly would be co-living, but it's not co-living. It's about the convivencia that happens there. And yeah, I think that like Locatora is actually not, yeah, there is like rants, and it's very critical. It's very critical. So they do critique power in some kind of way, like in every podcast, but they're not fighting with each other. But so they are having fun with each other. But Bricia and Paulina of Super Mamás are definitely not critical of because even I push back about the idea of being a super mama. It's like, I don't want to be super, that's not for me, right? But so yeah, that's where it comes from, and I have to think about the how can there be a not happy, a negative convivencia, or is that another element that I should include when I talk about convivencia, like the positivity, the joy, the life force, right, as opposed to a place that's negative. Maybe it's something I need to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe Ralph.
Hola, Ralph.
Hi, Esther. How are you doing?
Good.
I think you're doing great.
Thank you.
So, yeah, Esther. Yeah, this is not a theoretical question at all. This kind of goes back to what I grew up with and stuff like that. So, I'm thinking like when I first heard Lydia Mendoza, and she was making Lydia Mendoza in South Texas, and she was making she started making records, I think, in the 20s and 30s. She was traveling with her family, and her family would they were traveling minstrels, right, or whatever, but anyway, she always sang, and her big song was Mal Hombre. And everyone always wanted to hear Mal Hombre. And, when I started thinking of Lydia Mendoza, I started thinking of the traditional ranchera and the female voice that would sometimes hit those songs and hit those notes. And Selena had a little bit of that quality, and Linda Ronstadt even had a little bit of that quality. And there was always something about that voice which was big, really big. And it was a kind of spirited voice that, now that I think of it, seemed to almost could be interpreted as, I'm not going to take your bullshit. And so I'm wondering about this entire tradition, all the way from the 20s, through the 30s, through the 50s and the 60s, and the stuff that one would hear, in La Frontera, to be honest, where I grew up, at least, was South Texas. But, there was a kind of a forcefulness there about the female voice, which was listened to. And now all of a sudden I'm thinking about these podcasts, and I'm trying to figure out how to put all of these traditions together in some fashion or another. And I'm wondering if you had thought about stuff long before podcasts, and that notion of the female voice saying basically, don't fuck with me, this is bullshit, don't give me BS.
Yeah, definitely, Ralph. So in sort of the introduction and the review, I guess, of the literature chapters, Lydia Mendoza does come up, and actually Sonia Robles is another person that's doing the U.S. Spanish language transnational radio. In her, more in her dissertation, she left it out of the book, unfortunately, but she does talk about women in transnational early radio, like in the 1940s, like Lidia Mendoza and many others that are documented in that work. And I read the oral history, and she's talking about the same dynamics of like being exploited, right? And so sort of the same dynamic that the locutoras go through, of exploitation and so forth. And also having to do the thing, or having to really fight to be an artist, right? Because in that time it was expected that you get a certain age and you marry, and you don't know, women are not allowed to have a career, and if they do have a musical career, an artistic career, well, they're putas, right? So that's definitely so. So in that tradition, like I would suggest Paquita la del Barrio, right, of that loudness, right, and Jenny Rivera would be like the more contemporary, banda version of I think his last name is Foster. I'm forgetting the first name. Foster is the last name, but he writes about Paquita la del Barrio and this idea of feminist rage as a type of the sonic performance. So I do draw from music studies as well, and I do connect the locutoras to these singers like Paquita la del Barrio, Jenny Rivera, Lidia Mendoza, especially Marlene Quinto, who was the radio DJ, the FM radio DJ. Because those are her she's Jenny Rivera is like her idol, right? And so and there's other recent scholarship too around Jenny Rivera, right? And sort of the gendered or the feminist rage, I guess, or that performance of that voice, right? That is speaking back. And so I guess in that tradition, the locutoras would be where they connect, but locutoras do a lot of they do music segments. So somewhere towards the 2/3 into the show, they'll actually play a song, in which is of the theme or whatever it is they're talking about, right? And so I would besides reggaeton, and certainly, ¿cómo se llama esta? La de WAP. What's her name? Cardi B, right? Would be more of like who they go to, who they reference. But other sort of women, like in hip hop, that they reference as sort of their musical idols, and not so much Paquita or Jenny, but I see definitely that tradition with Marlene Quinto. But I think that's all I have in my breadcrumbs right here. Ya no tengo más, but I would definitely suggest you listen to Paquita la del Barrio. And I do make those connections. Oh, thank you. Someone put it up. D.W. Foster. Singing feminist rage. So I do, in my research, I do go to, music studies to bring in the language that they're using as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Gracias. Okay. Who's next? ¿Alguien más?
Rachel has a question.
Okay.
Hey, hi, Esther. Thank you. That was a great presentation. And it really, it helps so much to be able to hear the voices of the podcasters and the locatoras. I guess my question to you, it relates to medium, because I'm assuming that you're going to have to kind of confront this issue in the book, because you're moving between chapters that talk about radio and AM radio and then podcasts. And I think what you're trying to do here is to kind of complicate this notion that there's been this kind of liberating transition from radio to podcasting. I mean, clearly with podcasting, you have so much sort of disaggregation and differentiation. You have such, but that you also have these spaces for the locatoras, to be transgressive, and that you would never hear their kind of banter on AM radio. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's like that this sort of transition to podcasting has kind of created these sort of safe spaces for the articulation of these alternative Latina and Chicana feminisms. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you do start off talking, and we heard in your seminar about Alicia Alarcón. And so I think you're trying, I guess I'm asking, are you trying to kind of complicate this idea that there's been this kind of there's been this sort of transition, and that things have opened up and that they've somehow gotten better for women in terms of the sort of proliferation of these spaces, because in some ways you had these kind of high profile characters that were trying to do kind of subversive and radical work through the medium of online radio, which we assume sort of comes with its own kind of garish sound and a certain sort of way of certain kinds of established ways of having a kind of often sexist banter between men and women.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the whole point about it is this better in some kind of way? I think where I see sort of the distinction, and I kind of like to make things difficult for myself because I specifically wanted to address commercial AM and FM radio, because I could, there's other models of radio like community radio, public radio, and of course we know Maria Hinojosa, right? But that's public radio, that's a different entity, right? Where in commercial radio, that's popular culture. And that's where things are like really, really, messy and contradictory. And there could be a lot of like sexism, right? So if in order for a woman to participate in these spaces, they need to know when they can, how they can sort of make that intervention, call it an interruption, right? How they interrupt misogyny, but they can't interrupt so much that they get blacklisted, right? So they kind of have to carve spaces. I guess I could use that idea too, of like carving spaces within these very difficult areas of like commercial radio, especially in the 90s and 2000s. I don't know if it's gotten any better in commercial radio, but how I see sort of this, and I use radiophonic just to sort of make this connection, right, across podcasting. And how I see another way to sort of look at it is to think about what audiences they're trying to reach, right? And so in the AM/FM commercial medium, they are trying to reach as many people as possible, right, so that they can get sponsors. And so you hear it in the discourse with like Alicia Larcon. She'll interpolate her audience as usted, like you, formal, right? Usted es una persona inteligente. You, because you are an intelligent person, you're tuning in, and you're like, oh yes, of course I'm intelligent. I'm going to tune into Alicia, and I'm not going to listen to the, el cucuy and the misogyny in the morning. I'm going to go to AM radio, because they're interpolating this audience, right, for their purposes. Whereas in FM radio, you hear the audience being interpolated as raza, or familia, or paisanos, right, which are these like large net sort of identities that work because, as a, immigrant that, is going to college, right, like away from my family and so forth, like, how do I maintain my Mexican identity? Well, I listen to banda, as problematic as it is. I listen to these radio stations, but because I consider myself a raza, and I'm still connected to this very, misogynist culture, for better or worse. And so when you move on to podcasting, they don't care. They don't care about reaching as many audience as possible. They don't really, in some instances, it doesn't really matter, because that's not their career. They're doing other things. They're students. They have a job, right? That's not their primary source of income, and they're not trying to make a living out of it. I think Locutoras transitioning to where they want to go into production. I don't know if they'll ever leave their other jobs, but because they're not doing this commercial model, it's still commercial media, I think, but they can be as specific as they want. So there is a fragmentation, right? It's a fragmentation where you're not trying to reach all of the raza or all of the familia, paisanos, or whatever. You're only trying to reach your locamores, right? Like locutoras, if you're a listener, then you're interpolated as a locatora, or excuse me, as a loca amores, like la loca fan, right? Or Chicana, then I'm a mother scholar, right? So there's ways in which they interpolate the listeners. And there is sort of this fragmentation, but there's also networks, right? If you listen to, Chicana Mother Work, you might also listen to Latinos Who Lunch. And if you listen to Latinos Who Lunch, you'll listen to Locatora Radio. So I guess this is part of how I would approach that explanation of the medium. Thank you.
Hey, Esther, thank you for the talk. I'm actually really glad that you ended with a comment about these podcasts as careers or not, because I did want to ask a little bit more about the economic relationships that were standing behind the ideological argument of the talk. Somewhat anecdotally, I have to bring up that, in the past week, I think for better or for worse, we've all learned that podcasts are really big business. And Spotify's defense of, Joe Rogan's podcast, airing COVID misinformation to millions and millions of people, and, actually dropping these really popular musical artists to protect his interests and continue to keep them on their platform. And I was really struck in two examples, one from Super Mamás, the introduction of the two women as business owners, and then the really interesting observation that you made about the gradual improvement of the sound in Locatora Radio. And I think you might have kind of answered my question already by saying that these podcasts are not really careers for the people who are involved in them. But I did want to ask a little bit more about, just sort of the size of listenership that you're working with, if there are advertisements on these podcasts, and how that might play into, I think in some versions of sound studies, sort of a growing orientation towards like podcast subscribership and fandom as a kind of like outstretch of pretty basic consumer culture. Right? These are the things that I collect and listen to, and these are the things that I don't really listen to or don't want to listen to. And if that's something that you've considered at all in the project, or that interests you in like your interviews and talking with these people.
Okay, so I'm so you want to know like what is their following in terms of numbers? How do they fund, like the economics behind it? I mean, yeah, that is part of the research, and it changes. So in terms of their following, I'd have to look at the numbers. I think that what happened was that back in 2016, 2017, when I was, initially starting this research, like you could actually see like how many followers they had. And then Apple like took that away to where like if they want to know how many actual people are listening, how many times, and all that, those type of statistics, they have to pay for their analytics, like their own locutoras have to pay. So that has shifted, and I need to kind of go back and revisit that, because when I was updating for this lecture, I'm like, okay, well, where's the numbers that I was working with before? I was trying to confirm and see if they gone up or down, and some of that wasn't available anymore. So, I mean, I can share that some of the numbers that I had in terms of how many times a particular podcast has been heard range anywhere from 200 to like 25,000 times. So it ranges. So those are sort of the numbers that I'm working with as far as their followings. I think the best way is to just ask them directly, because it's hard to gather from all the different platforms in which they post. And do I count their Instagram followers? And, I have to find them and like all the things, and see what's available. And some of those numbers are not available to the public because they, I guess that's part of the economic model, is like they sell the analytics back to the podcasters, so that then the podcasters can go to a sponsor, right? And say, look, I have so many listeners, right? Or they can take this data and use it to sell spots. And so, yeah, in some cases they do. I think Chicana M is the one that doesn't like partner. They call it like partnership. They don't partner with other brands. But it's just the nature of what they do. They're doing it more as an academic and ideological project. But with Super Mamás, yeah, they're definitely trying to partner with as many people as possible. So they have gotten a paid trip to go to Disney World with their family. And what they do, and they get this, partnership, and in return, they do a whole episode about their trip to Disney World, and then they just speak well about Disney, right? And they promote Disney products indirectly, but not really like, okay, we're gonna pay you this once, and you'll talk about Encanto. No, that's just part of their life. and they have this partnership, and in turn they get more exposure to their brand through, you know, anyone that's listening to the whatever podcast through Disney, and then that brings more customers for their restaurant, right? That will go and check out and buy their cookbook, or that will open up opportunities for them. For example, they were on Tastemade, which is food network sort of thing. And so that opens up other sort of opportunities. So that's kind of how it works through like partnerships. They've also partnered with Target, and so they'll go to Target, and I don't know, I need to ask them if Target, you know, gives them some kind of gift card or whatever, but they'll go to Target and then they'll come back and do an episode or a mini segment where they talk about what they bought at Target that time, you know, through like a Super Mamás thing. So that's sort of how that sharing branding sort of economy works. But in other cases, they will, you know, sell things directly. I think at one point, Locatora Radio was doing a commercial spot for like a travel agency, I want to say, or like something like that, where you could tell that this was just a commercial spot and they got paid, you know, to do it. So that kind of, I guess I need to go back and revisit all that information. But what I can tell you, it kind of shifts, and I guess I have more understanding for the Super Mama model than what Locatora is doing. Locatora is transitioning now, where, you know, it's kind of sad now, but they're creating more and more content. But like the podcast will continue to be free, but they're not going to be making it as often. But if you want to follow them, listen to their other podcast, that's Marihuaneras, that it's all about like smoking weed and being fantastic, right? Then you have to pay for that one through Patreon. Or, you know, they also have like OnlyFans and things like that. So that's also part of their model.
More questions, more comments for Esther. Oh,
Yeah.
Veronica? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Esther.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. This was great. I have a question that may be more about the Chicana mother work folks in the podcast. But given that the online discourse has been a really great space for bringing that for bringing academia into the streets, how do you see the role of Latina podcasts, particularly them, in bringing our discourse into community, given the rise of intersectionality in the community over the last few years and different kinds of frameworks that have traditionally been on campuses?
I think I would have to ask, go back and ask Chicana mother work, like if, like how like what kind of, like how do you measure, like if you've had that impact, right? Because they definitely know that they've connected with other Chicana mother scholars, because we connect with each other through Instagram and so forth. Locatora Radio, I know about sort of the impact they're making, because then they get invited by like people like me, right, that listen to them and they're like, oh, let's bring you to campus, right? And they went through a period where they were like visiting all the campus all up and down California. I actually invited them for to my graduate seminar for another sort of sci-fi project that they were doing. And so we know that they reach, I guess, community, right? Or through those sort of invitations. But I think I would have to think about, well, how do you measure that? You know, do you measure that in followers? Because since we all live digital lives now, like, do we measure a number of followers, and how do we know who those followers are, what their age is, where they live? You know, how do we know that we're going? Because I know that is their stated intent to reach other, you know, women outside of academia as well. Pero no sé, but I had to think about that question. Well, how do we measure that? You know, but another one that I would suggest that was part initially of my research, but then I just decided to kind of narrow it down to Los Angeles. But one that is based out of the Midwest that is also was started around 2015, 2016. It's called Latina theory, and these are Midwesterners, two Latinas, not Mexican, not Chicanas, that their intention was actually this what you mentioned. They said, well, we're learning about, Ansaldúa and Casillas and, Bell Hooks, and we're learning all these things. Now let's break this theory down and make it accessible for, and I think they were graduate students. And that was their intention. Their intention was to create these mini lectures to like reach, to do exactly what you're describing. But yeah, I guess because that's a question. Well, how do we know that that's taking place? How do we measure that? Thank you.
Thanks.
Adam.
Thank you, Esther. What a great talk. I'm so excited about your work, and I can't wait for your book. You have me thinking about so much, and both in the talk and the Q&A period. And one of the things that I really appreciated was including the short clips of each of the different podcasts, and we get a real sense of the diversity kind of within kind of this world of Latina Chicana podcasting. And I wondered also, I was thinking at the beginning when you were presenting kind of podcasting and radio and what the larger project looks at, kind of the different audiences that these shows or these programs are reaching. And also strikes me that, there's certainly perhaps like a class dimension there. There's also generational differences. And I wonder kind of if you could speak a little more maybe about the role that class or generation plays within, the broader project.
Yeah, I think that's part of what one of the things I want to describe, right? Like the diversity, the differences, because typically you think Latina feminisms, your mind goes to Chicana feminist theory, to Ansaldúa, right? To like people that are involved in the actual like activism and movement, but you don't think like, oh, well, commercial radio, right? You don't think of these spaces that are popular and contradictory and all these things. So I think that's the big point that I'm making with the book is like, there's many, right? And it's hard to say, well, this is feminism and it's not. It's just sort of saying, okay, well, this is what it's after, this is what it's achieving, but it might not be doing what, it's not critical, but it's still doing something. We can critique it, we can describe it, but I wouldn't want to, for example, I don't want to just strike off Super Mamás as being, oh, well, they're just branding, they're just marketing, they're not critical. They're also doing other very important things with like talking about these issues of like raising bicultural children and miscarriages and C-sections and traditional birthing practices. So I guess that is part of the point that I'm making. It's about all these different feminisms and popular culture. And in terms of the different audiences and generational differences, yeah, I think that's sort of the what I'm trying to do, throughout the book, to sort of begin with Alicia Larcón, who's representing, well, she started radio in the 90s, but she had been working in the newspaper in La Opinión for 10 years, also starting, from the bottom. And so I think that with her, she's sort of representing this time, I guess, when there was a boom in like Mexican migration, right? And sort of all the politics that were happening around like Prop 187 and like the driver's licenses, people getting their car towed, and just all the anti-Latino sentiment of like the 90s and 2000s. And also, because it's radio, she also critiques media a lot. So she begins by critiquing Spanish language media, but then goes on to critique like the Tea Party movement and all their radio hosts. Can't remember their names right now, but it doesn't matter. We don't need to say their names. But like those radio hosts, I don't know, no recuerdo. Pero so yeah, so sort of like those were the politics of that generation, and that would be what, like what's before the millennials, the Gen X and early millennials, and then with Marlene Quinto, she's representing sort of like the dreamer generation, right? Because she wasn't, she I don't know, she's still undocumented. No le he preguntado. Something you don't ask, but I guess I should. But she was undocumented for a long time. And, she grows up with this other sort of culture, right? And other politics and like post 9/11 politics and this sort of thing. And like with the podcast, now we're talking about like late millennials. I don't think Locatora would identify as Gen Z. I don't think they want to, but they're like on the cusp. So there's I'm contextualizing sort of the Latino politics of the time, right? But also the changing media landscape, right? So I think that's how I'm addressing that. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Well, if there are no more questions, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Esther so much for a stimulating talk and great Q&A. And I think we're all looking forward to hearing more of this work as it moves along. It's been a great afternoon listening to your thoughts and the responses to questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for coming out, and I'm really pumped about like continuing my writing now, and thank you for the great feedback. I'm really glad that you enjoyed it. Gracias. Que pasen buenas noches.